Hi everybody, it's week 2 of History 202, and I wanted to say a little bit about Chapter 17, which is you're going to be reading this week. I hope what you get out of this is that the American West, although cowboys and Indians were certainly part of it, it certainly was not the whole story. There was much more to it than that. There was a huge influx of immigrants into the West during the late years of the 19th century, just as there was into the American East. Europeans, Asians, Canadians, Latin Americans, African Americans, they all helped to populate the region between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. The only exception to that was the Chinese. You're going to read in a later chapter that they were excluded from the United States in 1882, but we'll talk more about that later. The chapter also talks about themes of migration from the East to the West. Because of the cheap land offered by the Homestead Act and a relatively easy way of getting across the continent because of the railroad networks, Americans settled more territory in the last 3 decades of the 19th century than they had settled in all the rest of American history up to that time. There's 2 myths that I hope will be busted by what you're reading. One is that the U.S. Army was not the only agent in destroying the culture of Native Americans. There was a lot of infighting that happened between tribes that took its toll on those tribes. The other myth I hope you understand at the end of this chapter is that Native Americans were not the only ethnic group that suffered from discrimination and prejudice. All the ethnic groups that I mentioned a minute ago suffered from that to some degree or another. The Native Americans simply got the most press for that in more ways than one. Some of the highlights you're going to want to take note of in this chapter are map 17.1 on page 451. That's called The Loss of Indian Lands. Mining on the Comstock on page 465. And map 17.3, which is called Federal Land Grants to Railroads and the Development of the West, which is on page 471. That talks about the growth of the railroad industry during the late 19th century. All right, happy reading. I'll talk to you soon.